morning. So this week's recipe requires an extra recipe that we haven't made yet. So bonus vlog. Today we're going to make Italian meringue buttercream, which is a French style buttercream. It's a little less sweet and definitely a lot more creamy than the American buttercream that you get in a lot of the grocery stores here. Most people really enjoy it. There have been a few people that I've come across that didn't like it as much just because it's not what they grew up with and it's completely different from anything that you've probably had. It is one of those more technical recipes, so I feel like the video portion of this is probably really important. We're going to go step by step. My blog post is going to be very informative. It'll have all the information you need. So first of all, we're going to go through a couple of things that you might want to have handy before you make this recipe. One of them is a candy thermometer. I had one. I left it at my last job. It's theirs now. They're only about $5 or $10. I haven't gone and bought a new one yet. With this recipe, I do it the old-fashioned way and I stick my fingers into the hot syrup. I'm going to show you how to do that so that you know how to use it, how to do it without a thermometer as well. If you want to be extra brave and join me in doing that, go for it. Another thing that you're going to need is you're going to need the whisk attachment for your KitchenAid. If you don't have a KitchenAid, you might be able to make this with a hand mixer. I personally have never done so because I have a KitchenAid, so why would I do it by hand? But if you do have a hand mixer, not a KitchenAid, you want to use your whisk attachment. That's going to be very important because you're going to make a meringue first. So with meringues, you use sugar and egg whites. For the Italian meringue, we're going to cook our sugar to 238 degrees. So keep that number in mind. If you're using a candy thermometer, go ahead and write it down or go find it in the blog. It'll be there as well. So we're going to cook the sugar to 238 degrees, and then we're going to add it to our whipped egg whites. And then we're going to let that just do its thing until it's cooled down. Once it's cooled down to room temperature, we're going to add butter slowly to it, and then that will help to give it the creaminess and more structure so that when we put it on our cake, it doesn't just like do the thing the meringue does and eventually break down. It's a very silky, smooth buttercream. It's very nice to work with. It's the only one that I use. I don't generally make American buttercream unless someone for some reason doesn't eat butter, doesn't eat dairy, and they can have sugar and Crisco. But if that's not the case, this is the one that I use. So when you make a meringue, there are three different types of meringue. I don't know if you can see it there. I'll include this on the blog as well. But you have stiff meringue, medium peak meringue, and then soft peak meringue. So basically, when you dip your whisk into your meringue, you'll pull it out, and if it all just kind of falls over, that's a soft meringue. If it kind of like peaks and then curves over like an eagle's beak, then that's your medium meringue. If you pull it out and it sticks straight up and it stays there, then that's your stiff meringue. So we're gonna whip our egg whites up to like a medium meringue before we add our hot sugar. The egg whites I have in a bag because I needed yolks for something. Don't ever throw your egg whites away. If you are making something and call us for only yolks, save your egg whites. You can do so much with these. I freeze them, and then when I need them, I take them out. Another thing about Italian meringue buttercream is I have used the pasteurized egg whites that you get in the dairy section. It says on there that you can't use them for a meringue. The process of pasteurization actually changes the properties of the egg white a little bit, but I actually have had a lot of success in using them to make buttercream with, because your meringue being so incredibly fluffy isn't as important for this recipe as it is for others. Just as long as it whips up to where you need it to be, then you're good to go. The one thing about the pasteurized egg whites though is I have noticed if you open it and you use what you need and you have left over, it has a tendency to collect condensation on the inside, and then that water on the inside, when you pour it to use it a second time, is going to completely kill any hopes of making meringue. So if you use the pasteurized egg whites, either use it all and make a bigger batch, or use whatever's left over for something else. Make yourself an omelet, but don't use the leftover that's been sitting in your fridge to make more buttercream because it's just going to be a disaster. It's not going to work. So I'm gonna go ahead and measure out my egg whites, and then I would usually go ahead and start whipping these on like a medium speed on my KitchenAid, and then just keep an eye on them. But I don't want the mixer to make funky noises while we're trying to talk about our sugar, so I'll hold off on that. Okay, for our sugar, we're going to take a pot. I'm making a small batch. My mixer doesn't like to make, well, it can make a full batch, but it takes it a long time to cool down. And as I said before, I'm impatient. I don't like to let it cool down, so I usually end up with a soupy mess. And when you have a soupy mess of a Italian meringue buttercream where you've added your butter before it cooled down and it becomes soup, it is savable. You can throw it in your refrigerator for a few minutes, let it start to harden up a little bit, and then whisk it, and it usually comes together. But if you can avoid that, it's best. So I usually do just a half batch in my KitchenAid because I'm impatient and I don't like to wait an hour for it to cool down properly. So you're going to put your sugar in here, and then you're going to add just enough water to wet your sugar. So I usually just add a little bit, stir it around with my finger, make sure that all of my sugar is wet, and then if it is, you're good to go. If not, add some more water. So you just want it to be just barely wet. There's not a whole lot of water sitting on the top of it. So then another important thing about making this is you want to make sure that there's no sugar on the sides of your pan. The reason being, as it's cooking, that sugar on the side is going to caramelize, and then it'll eventually burn, and then that will A, get into your sugar syrup, and then B, it could potentially cause the rest of it to crystallize. So sugar is made up of crystals, sugar crystals, and when you cook it, it breaks those crystals down. But if it gets agitated, if you stir it, so that's one thing you don't want to do, is you're not going to stir this at all after this point once you turn on the heat. If you stir it, or if it comes in contact with those burnt crystals, it's going to crystallize, and you're going to be left with a thick, hard mess. And it's not going to be a nice syrup. It's not going to be something you want to add to your eggs, because there's just going to be egg whites with hard sugar pieces in it, and it's disgusting, and you don't want to use it, obviously. So if you have sugar on the side, you can take a wet pastry brush. Remember, we got these from Home Depot. But you can take a brush and just brush your sides and make sure that you get all that sugar down. I usually forgo this because now I have to wash it, and I don't want to wash extra dishes, and usually just dip my finger in some water and go around the sides. So the other thing that I like to do is when I first put this on the stove to cook, I will add a lid to it, and that also helps keep the sides clean, because what happens is all that condensation rises to the top and then it washes down the sides as it runs down the sides of the pot. So I'll leave this on until the sugar starts to boil. Once the sugar starts to boil, I'll take the lid off so I can keep an eye on the syrup itself, because we don't want it to cook too much. If you cook it too much, it becomes the consistency of that red sugar that is on the outside of a candied apple. It's called hard cracked sugar because it's hard. And when you put that into your egg whites, it's the same thing as if you were to put the crystallized sugar into your egg whites. It's nasty. It's not workable. It's just shards of sharp sugar in your egg whites. And sugar will cut you just like glass. It's not fun. Personal experience. So we're going to cook this until it's boiling, and then we're going to take the lid off, and then we're going to watch it, and then as soon as it gets to the point that we need it to be at 238 degrees, it's a consistency called softball. So when we dip our fingers in the hot sugar, we're going to freeze them first, because if you freeze them in ice water, then you won't feel the heat on your fingers. So we're going to freeze our fingers, dip our fingers in it, and then we're going to play with the sugar on the end of it. This is the fun part of pastry. We're going to play with the sugar on the end of our fingers, and if it forms a ball that you can squish, it's called softball. That's the point when we're going to turn it off, and we're going to add it to our egg whites. So once it gets to that point, it's a really fast-moving process, and then once it's in our egg whites and it's doing its thing, then we're going to take a break again, because then that's another slow part where we just have to wait for it to cool down. So we're going to start cooking the sugar, and we'll be back when it's ready to be added to the egg whites. Alright, so our sugar syrup is still cooking. We're not quite at the point where I've taken the lid off yet, but I have whipped my egg whites, and I just wanted to show you what that looks like. So I've actually whipped them a little bit more than I would have. If you go any further than this, you got to start over. But this is where we are. We're at stiff peak. So you pull it out, and it kind of just holds its shape. It's very marshmallowy almost. So that's where we're going to stop. I am going to put it back on there, and I'm going to keep it stirring on the lowest possible setting, because you don't want it to sit like this. It'll start to separate, it'll start to dry out, and that's also not something we want for egg whites. So we want to keep them moving, but we don't really want to whip any more air into them. So we're going to put it back on and let it stir on a very low speed until our syrup is ready to add to it. So we have our syrup. As you can see, the bubbles have gotten bigger and they're starting to slow down a little bit. That's the point where we want to start testing. So I have my fingers dipped in this nice cold ice water, and then I'm going to dip them in the sugar and back in the water. That's the important part. You don't want to leave the hot sugar on your fingers. And as you can see, I formed this nice little ball of sugar. It's kind of squishy. That's exactly where we want to be. We don't want to cook it anymore. I've already turned my burner off, but we want to get it into our egg whites as soon as possible. So we're going to go over here. There's our nice little egg whites. I'm going to turn it up to like medium, and then we're going to slowly stream this in. If you go down the side of the bowl, you'll make sure that it kind of goes all in there. If you don't go down the side, the whisk will kind of just throw it all over the place. Okay, so in the blog, I'm going to put the directions on how to do this the correct way, but in the video, I'm going to show you the Impatient Amanda way. So, as you can see, it's cooled down. It's become this nice, beautiful, silky meringue, and it looks like we're at medium peaks, but if you have too much meringue on your thing, it'll do that. So as you can see, it's not going to cooperate for the video. But we're actually at stiff peak. See how it's just standing there beautifully tall. So another thing to notice, so that you know that you've done it right, is our meringue actually rose in the bowl when we added the syrup, and now it's actually all the way down there. So it sank back in as it's cooled down. The bowl is actually kind of warm, and when I say kind of warm, think of a baby's bath water. If you're doing this the proper way, you want it to be room temperature, so when you touch your bowl, it won't be warm and it won't be like cold. But my butter is cold because I didn't soften it, which is also the proper way. When you soften it, you should be able to put an indent in it with your finger. As you can see, we can't. Also notice I cut my butter into quarters so that they're about ½ an inch or so big squares. So we're going to add our butter to our meringue a few pieces at a time. But because the meringue is still a little bit warm and my butter is cold, it'll even it out in the end, theoretically. I have done it this super fast way before and screwed up and had to throw it in the fridge. Been patient and let it cool so that I could actually whip it up. But if it's not too warm, this way will work. So you can see it's a little bit soupy, but there are definitely big chunks of butter in there still, so I'm going to actually kick it up to high gear until it comes together, and then I'll show you what that looks like. So we're not quite there yet, but I wanted to show you this. There's always this stage between me freaking out thinking, oh my gosh, I've ruined it, it's so soupy, and it actually coming together where it kind of looks a little bit like curdled cheese. It's really disgusting, actually. So when you get to this point, you want to let it just keep going so it smooths itself out and you end up with that nice creamy buttercream that we're looking for. And our nice smooth creamy buttercream. This is too cold to use. As you can see, it's pretty yellow right now. You can really see it in the bowl. It kind of just looks like whipped butter. So before you would use this, you would heat it up. I usually make my buttercream a day ahead, because I find it easier to make sure that it's the right temperature or the right consistency to use when I just throw it in the microwave for a few seconds and I can throw it in the bowl and whip it up. if you have it in the bowl still and it's this consistency, you would just throw a pot of water on the oven and then stick your bowl right in the pot of water and just heat it ever so slightly. I usually let it get to the point where it's kind of melty around the sides and underneath, so that you have a little bit of warmth on it. And then what you would do is you would switch to your paddle guy, and that will help further smooth it out. At this point, you can also add your flavorings. I'm just going to use vanilla today, and I'm going to go ahead and heat it on the stove, until it gets to the consistency that we want it to be, and then I'm going to show you what that looks like, and then we're going to whip it up, and you can see how much creamier it is when it's at the right temperature. Alright, so as you can see, it's a little bit melty around the edges, but most of it in the middle is still pretty thick. So we're going to put our paddle on there. Alright, so now we have this nice silky buttercream. Your bowl should not be cold, it shouldn't be warm, it should be kind of like neutrally. But as you can see, it's a lot smoother, it's a lot easier to work with. That's what you want. That's going to be beautiful to put on a cake. It's going to be beautiful to ice, to pipe on to cupcakes. It's just nice and lovely. But that's how you would recondition your buttercream. So if you were to, at the last step before we put it back over the stove, you can actually stop there if you don't need it that day. You can stop there, wrap it in plastic wrap, throw it in your refrigerator, and then the next day you take it out and you would just heat it in the microwave for maybe 30 seconds to a minute until it is a little bit squishy. You don't want it to be melted, because then you have to wait for it to solidify again. But just a little bit squishy, and then you throw it in here and whip it up with this guy. Or you could just chop it up a little bit, throw it into this bowl, put it over your stove, and then whip it up, and it would be the same thing. But this is the consistency you're looking for. The nice, smooth, easy to work with, not hot, not cold, kind of neutrally.